Welcome to the University of San Francisco. My name is Ludwig Chincarini. This is the Silk Lectures featuring Nobel Laureates. Normally Jeff Silk would do this piece, but he's asked me to do it tonight. The purpose of this series is to allow students, faculty, and staff of USF, as well as the outside community, to have access to great avenues of thought, as evidenced by people who have changed the world with their ideas. Very few people ever meet a Nobel Prize winner or hear their ideas in person. With the Silk Lectures featuring Nobel Laureates, we want to change that. The structure tonight shall be a 45-minute lecture followed by a 30 to 35-minute question and answer session. We have lots of questions, so please be patient because they're things that you probably want to know about. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to thank everyone that has come tonight. I'd also like to thank the CFA members for coming tonight and the CFA for working with us to offer these events to their organization, in particular Ann O'Brien. We thank the students that help organize, especially Marcus and the staff of USF like Jazz Johnson, Sam Bethel, Wilma Kay, and Stephanie Dixon for making things work very well. Most importantly, I want to thank Jeff Silk, Naomi Silk, and the Silk family for continuing to contribute and make the University of San Francisco a better place. We also would like to thank the president of USF, Father Paul, and the provost of USF, Don Heller, for supporting our efforts. Could we please give a hand for the Silk family? Could we please give a hand for the University of San Francisco and making the world a better place? Lastly, if you could turn off your cell phone and please refrain from using it during the guest speaker's talk. The year is 1971. Peter Diamond asked a simple question. What if supply and demand are not just static, but that agents need to take time to find a price and make a decision? For example, all of us know as customers that we might have to travel to a store, inform ourselves about the price of a good, and then make a decision whether to buy or not buy. Does this process lead to a different equilibrium price as opposed to when there is zero search cost? Diamond found that it did. In fact, he realized that stores have market power that might lead to higher prices than in a competitive equilibrium. I think we've all sort of felt this when we go to the store. Moreover, the same good sells at different prices in different stores and on different places on the internet. This was his first contribution to search theory. Search theory today focuses on issues related to job hunting, finding a mate, or to find a house, but also continues to look at consumer markets. In 1974, our guest speaker joined a panel for the Senate Finance Committee to look at our financial position of Social Security. It was a mess, much worse than it is today. Most of our guest speaker's career has been focused on retirement issues, particularly Social Security, along with issues of taxation and unemployment, and he has also explored how income tax rates should vary with different income levels. In fact, our guest speaker has written about Social Security in the United States and in countries as diverse as China, Sweden, and Chile. He has also advised those governments of how to do Social Security in those countries. One of his notable books, Saving Social Security, provided a guideline on how to restore solvency to the United States Social Security system. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2010. Peter is currently an emeritus professor of economics at MIT. He obtained his BA from the Yale University in mathematics, and he started his math PhD at MIT, but he had the good sense to switch over to economics, and he got his PhD from MIT in economics. I would like to tell you two funny stories about our guest speaker. The first has to do with Peter Diamond, the perfectionist. In graduate school, he was known to be very tough on his students. In fact, one time, a graduate student who had worked months on a new paper showed it to Diamond and asked him what he thought about the paper. Diamond replied, "It's not terrible." Another funny story has to do with politics and the Nobel Prize. In 2010, Diamond was appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, but had to withdraw because some senators said he was unqualified for the job. That was the same year he won the Nobel Prize in Economics. Today, he will discuss a passion of his, restructuring Social Security. For the young people in the audience, you get very excited about the environment, but no one's getting excited about Social Security. And according to some people, in the year 2089, it's going to be 11 trillion in debt. In other words, you're not getting any. So you might want to listen carefully to get a more accurate picture from today's speaker. Could you please give a warm welcome for this unqualified economist from MIT, Dr. Peter Diamond.
I'm glad to be here. I'm always glad to be back in the Bay Area. I even one year lived in San Francisco and reverse commuted to Berkeley when I was teaching there. So I have very fond memories. And I met my wife here. And we're still married. So I'm going to, first of all, say a little bit about the current position of Social Security. And then I'll take us through a bit of history, the political side of it, as part of framing what my title is, which is trying to predict the future politics of dealing with it. First, what's the current position? Social Security has a board of trustees, and every year they put out a report. All the real work is done by the Office of the Actuary, which has a very, very positive reputation and plays a major role in Congress framing what it thinks is the appropriate limits for what should be done. So this comes from the most recent annual report. First thing is, Social Security has two trust funds, one for the retirement program, one for the disability program, but Congress doesn't hesitate to move money between the two. So people think of it as one trust fund. And right now, there's $2.9 trillion in it. It's all invested in Social Security bonds. Special bonds issued to them have a few wrinkles in them that make them a little bit better. But the interest rates on them are indexed to market rates. So it's earning the same returns that you and I would be earning holding these bonds. What they do is every year they look ahead 75 years. So they're looking one more year into the future each year as it goes along. And they look at the most likely projection, as they can see it, of the trust fund. And they also do some other variants and some stochastic models. We don't have to worry about that. But they concluded that there wasn't enough money to pay all of benefits. When you heard somebody make reference to there'll be nothing there, don't listen to them. We'll get back to that. Wouldn't be enough money to pay all of the benefits because the trust fund would be depleted in 2035. And if today, or as of the end of last year, Congress wanted to make sure there was enough money to cover 75 years, they would have to boost the payroll tax rate by just under 3%. So it's a problem. It's serious. We have a bit of time. Doing things sooner is better than later. I'll touch on that later on. But it's not climate change with God knows what's going to happen. And it's not climate change in the sense that we know how to fix it. The only issue is what do we collectively really want it to be and what will the political process do about it? Very different again from climate change. So how does it work? This is a picture taken from the annual report. The line that's a little bit wiggly and basically horizontal is the revenue that comes into Social Security each year. The left-hand part is history. The right-hand part is the projection. It's pretty flat because it's measured relative to the part of payroll that's subject to tax. And that's the bulk of the revenue. Get some other revenue too, we don't have to worry about that. The solid line, which goes marching up, is the cost of paying benefits under the current rules, what are often referred to as scheduled benefits. But the law says Social Security cannot borrow. So when the trust fund hits zero, the only money they can pay out is the money that's coming in from the payroll tax and the few other revenues that come in. And so unless Congress stops collecting the payroll tax, there'll be money flowing in and money flowing out. And the law doesn't actually say what they can do, it just says what they can't do. But this has always been interpreted as everybody's benefit will be cut by the same percentage amount. And as you can see from the chart, that would be 20%. A lot of this, of course, was driven by the baby boomers. And the entry of the baby boomers into the market and the anticipation that they would eventually be retiring is what led to the plan to build up that big trust fund that we have. And part of the initial plan was we'll build it up and we'll run it down to cover them. And you'll notice after this, there's not a whole lot of big change. The baby boomers made the big change in revenue, make the big change in expenditures, and then there's continuing aging in the population, and there's some thoughts of what might be happening to wages, but you can see there's not huge changes after that if we could get through that first part. So how does the public see this? Well, retirees are asked, will you continue to get all of the benefits that you're getting now, including the cost of living adjustments that you get each year? And here are 3 Gallup surveys, and a large fraction expect to see full benefits. They think somehow Congress is going to solve this problem without affecting them. But roughly comparable amount see it the other way around. They think there will be cuts in benefits for them. And the sensitivity of retirees to cuts in benefits is one of the critical parts of the political process around Social Security that has led Social Security to be repeatedly referred to as the third rail of American politics. What happens if we ask the young, the non-retirees, do you think you will get a benefit? And a lot of yeses and a lot of nos, varying with age. But the first point I wanted to make is all those no's people are wrong. Not necessarily wrong. Congress could say we'll pay the retirees and stop paying others. But that's not the way the law would work right now. And that would be to my mind, politically dangerous thing for any congressman to do. There are a lot of voters who aren't retirees. The retirees vote in larger percentages, but that's only part of the story. And then it's a very popular program. People want to see it rescued, and if asked, what do you want to raise taxes or curb benefits, there's a fairly even split in the population. That's the wrong question. The question I would have liked to have seen, but I don't run Gallup, was to include the option of a mix of the two. Because in other focus group things I've read about, the mix of the two is the most popular answer coming from the general public. So a couple of words about Social Security. It's not a huge ton of money. You don't really want to live on Social Security and nothing else. So there you see the numbers for average benefits. It makes a difference, but it's not huge. The level you get varies with your history of earnings that you paid taxes on. So this is an average benefit. And the other thing to keep in mind is Social Security covers a range of ages. First of all, there are retirees of quite a range of ages, but children might be getting a benefit, a child of a disabled worker, a child of a deceased worker, and then perhaps the surviving parent with looking after children, after a deceased worker, there'd be benefits there. So there's a wide range of ages that are presented. And how does Social Security fit in our overall retirement? Well, beyond Social Security, there are retirement plans run by employers, run by state and local governments, and individuals can set up IRAs and other variants themselves. But Social Security plays a big role in it. And to give you a sense of what it's like, a recent study, most of the earlier descriptions of the reliance on Social Security came from surveys. Surveys can give you a lot of related information, but surveys have well-known errors in them, consistent errors. And so a couple of researchers decided to dig in, which you can now do with all the amazing data access, to look at the W-2s that got filed for every single worker. So any worker that had a 401k plan, there'd be a deduction from the worker's pay, and that would be reported on the W-2, and 79% of workers were at firms that had such it, but of those, only 40% made a contribution. And this roughly fits with the picture from the surveys that in any year, about half the working population are actually making any contribution. This doesn't cover everything. Defined benefits come in a different way, and for tax reasons, Roth 401ks don't get reported, only regular 401ks. So again, it's approximate, but what it does measure, it's getting exactly. So let's turn to the legislative history. Social Security started in the 30s. So from the beginning up until 1972, every few years, Congress would change the level of benefits, change the level of earnings subject to tax, if needed, change the tax rate. They had the wit to avoid the political backlash about tax increases by always having on the book a future tax increase, which doesn't get a whole lot of attention until it rolls around. And then the politicians say, we'll repeal that, don't worry, but they don't. And so Social Security got the numbers. And then in the 60s, inflation started to pick up. So Congress needed to move more often. And to begin with, they loved it. They'd vote a benefit increase and a bit of an increase in the earnings subject to tax, but that would barely be noticed by the general public. And the retirees would thank their congressman when they came home. Everyone was very happy. But they then got used to having these frequent increases, and they understood it was connected to inflation. So congressmen would get home, and the retirees would say, how come the increase was so small this year? And they were less happy about being politicians doing it each year. So they asked the Office of the Actuary to design a law which would do what in practice Congress had been doing. And so in 1972, and that's what it says on the slide, we got automatic indexing of the benefits in payment for inflation, and we got automatic increases for the maximum of earnings subject to tax. But there was one catch. What Congress had been doing in its way, we'll leave out adjectives, was actually not a good design. And when written into law, it meant that the system was over-indexed. That means when inflation picks up, it would be rising faster than inflation. That would create perhaps a cost problem. In a hearing before the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Roth said to the chief actuary, brand new chief actuary, first year on the job, Senator Roth said, I understand the system is over-indexed. Is that true, and is it a problem? And the chief actuary said, yes, it is true. They're very professional, they understand. But it's not a problem because the inflation rates the US has had historically, the system can afford this. 1972 was not a good time to rely on continued low inflation. So starting a year later, well, a couple of years later, because there was a delay till it kicked in, the system started exploding. And that's when I first got involved. As Ludwig said, in '74, I was consulting to the Senate Finance Committee to confirm there was a problem and then to help lay out various options for looking at it. And by '77, things had become bad enough that even though it wasn't about to run out of money, they decided they've got to change the system. And after various rival candidates for the new system, they gave us basically the current system we had, which is the way you calculate the new benefit for new retirees was going to be different than in before, and it would use a wage index rather than just looking at the numbers. They knew at the time, according to the Office of the Actuary, that they hadn't solved the problem for 75 years. You can see the problem had gotten very large, that measure of the actuarial deficit for 75 years. They would have had to jump the payroll tax rate by just over 8% to get to 75 years. They did enough so that the hole that was left was only 1.4%. And they thought they had enough money to make it into the early 80s. Baby boomers would be into the labor force, paying taxes, and then we'd be fine for a while, and sometime out in the future, we'd have a problem. Didn't cover 75 years. But the economy went bad in the late 80s, in the late 70s and early 80s. And so we didn't get that picture, we got this picture. So this is the 1983 Trustees Report saying that here are the deficits we see over the next decade. And as you can see, the problem keeps getting smaller and smaller as those baby boomers are pitching in. But trust fund would hit zero before this turned around, and everybody would get a benefit cut. Back then, the process of programming the computers to mail out the checks took a number of months. So there was a hard deadline. If Congress didn't pass the bill by the deadline for the beginning of programming the computers, everybody was going to get a benefit cut, and the congressman would hear about it. So we got a change. The law was passed with, probably a week or two to spare, very last minute, so that there wouldn't be any benefit cuts coming. In order to do that, the president and Congress appointed a commission headed by Alan Greenspan. Got a lot of attention at the time, and they recommended and Congress passed the law which dealt with the short-term problem until the baby boomers had cut in. And it was a fairly balanced law, not too far off, half and half on doing things on the revenue side, doing things on the expenditure side. This is divided up a slightly different way. But they couldn't come to an agreement about what to do for the long run. So instead of there being a recommendation that Congress carried out, they decided on a political process, because they needed to have an answer, that they would have a split bill coming from the Social Security Subcommittee in the House, and there'd be 2 amendments allowed to the bill, and then one of those 3 versions would be voted up or down. Maybe there'd be nothing and things would crash, but everyone knew Congress wouldn't put up with that. So there were 2 bills, one put forward by J.J. Pickle, the other by Claude Pepper. It was called the Pepper-Pickle fight. And Pickle, a conservative Democrat, wanted to do all of the long-run problem that they needed by cutting benefits. It's stated as increasing the age at which you get the full benefit, but as I'll explain in a moment, it's just a vocabulary for cutting benefits. Claude Pepper, a liberal Southern Democrat from Florida, just wanted to do all of the action on the tax rate. And so that would keep the benefits going according to the schedule as it then existed. Notice both of these solutions were way down the road with the anticipation that there'd be no political backlash to increasing a tax 20 years later or 30 years later, and that was right. So it went to Congress, and as you can see, the Republicans were close to unanimous for cutting benefits and even closer to unanimous for not raising taxes, and the Democrats, a much broader party than it is now, split, and so the Republican solution happened. Why do I refer to this as a benefit cut? They take, when you retire, they look at your history of earnings, and based on that history of earnings, they calculate your average earnings over your career. It's an index number, we don't need details. And then there's a benefit that's a function of your average earnings. They call it the primary insurance amount. And that's what you'll get at a benefit if you retire at the age for full benefits. Retire earlier, you get a reduction because of early retirement. Retire later, and by retire I mean start benefits. That's the key for the financial implications. Retire later, you get a larger benefit. So you see in the newspaper frequently columns saying, wait till 70 if you can afford it, because you'll get a bigger benefit that will last as long as you live and keep up with inflation. This is comparing what would happen if the age for full benefits was 67, as is the current law. We're not there yet. And if you changed it to 70, which had been proposed by a number of people. So the yellow bars show 100% of that calculation that comes out of the formula is what you would get at 67. The blue bar says if the age for full benefits was 70 and you still retired at 67, you would get 80%, or just rather than 100% of what came from the formula. So for any age at which you retired, the blue bar is shorter than the yellow bar, and to my mind, calling that a benefit cut seems the right vocabulary, but it's a vocabulary they work hard to avoid. So I've told you the story the way it went. The key players were President Reagan and Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill. They appointed the Greenspan Commission. The Greenspan Commission came up with a solution, and see what happened. And so let's not worry about getting close to running out of money. We'll appoint a commission and everything will be fine. Bob Ball was on the commission. Bob Ball had been Commissioner of Social Security. Bob Ball was Tip O'Neill's point man for dealing with this. They realized that the commission was divided and couldn't come up with any recommendation. So Reagan and O'Neill decided to have a secret group that would meet, and they would come up with a plan, and then they'd go to the commission and convince the commission to accept the plan. So it's the reverse. The point of a commission is to come up with a plan which you carry to the principals to solve their problem. That wasn't working, so the principals were coming up with a plan, and they were going to take it to the commission to convince the commission to do it. Well, they got the early part through that way, and then they agreed on a process for the later part. And this was all done with complete secrecy. Bob Ball, late Bob Ball, he died in his 90s, still working on Social Security right up till the end. said the press got wind that they were meeting at somebody's house to discuss this. There were about half a dozen people, both appointed by the two and representing, I think Senator Dole was part of this. They drew in people who had clout in Congress. Press were outside, so we couldn't leave by the front door. The back door led to a hill that went down. They had to go sliding down the hill to avoid the press. Anyway, if you think it's easy to appoint a commission, so what they did was just enough to get through, they thought. And so first thing would happen, each year you're looking another year into that 75-year future, and the population's much older, and things start not looking good right off the bat. And they get steadily worse. And as you saw for the picture, it looks like the 75-year plan was enough for 50 years. I mean, that certainly kept it off the political table for a long time. But what's happened since then, because we've been aware we had a problem since the late 80s. We've had 3 presidents appoint commissions. And the legislation that's come out of that is, as I'm sure you're all aware, nothing. So what's the current position? Here's back on the Trustees Report. How big are those deficits now? Well, you can see the deficit is currently around 7%. This is the deficit just looking at the revenue coming in and the expenditures going out, not counting the interest coming on the trust fund, not coming on using the trust fund, which is what we're getting close to. So it's quite substantial, but the thing to notice is it keeps getting bigger until well on in after it's run out of money. And how big is the problem if Congress attempts to do its 75-year projection? Well, that keeps getting bigger. It's substantial, but not out of sight. It gets more substantial, but still not out of sight. So in terms of could we, if we chose to do that, afford to just do this? Yes. Could we instead do some fraction or 100% on benefit cuts? Yes. We know how to do this. It's money in and money out, and we write the laws with the rules of money in, money out, and we can have a 75-year projection that we have some degree of confidence in. So what are the questions about the future of Social Security? Will we get legislation, or will everyone get a benefit cut? I'm certainly of the group that thinks we will get legislation. The hope is we'll get it sooner, because if you get it sooner, you've got more options to deal with things. You've got more money in the bank to be using. When will we get it? I think the last minute is inevitable, unless something makes it a question that every candidate for Congress and president has to answer. What would you do about Social Security? But I took a quick scan through the websites of some of the candidates. The statement you get is, I'm a supporter of Social Security. That's not exactly a plan. And you'll probably find the same vocabulary if we had a whole bunch of candidates running in both parties. How? Just form a commission? Well, I'm sure there'll be a commission, but whether that will be enough without serious interventions is unclear. Reagan and O'Neill had a good working relationship. I could imagine a president and a Speaker of the House that don't get along. Can you imagine that? And then perhaps we won't get legislation. But the cost to the sitting politicians is such, I think they'll find a way. So what will come out of this process? Some people have thought, well, you wait for the last minute, you can raise taxes more than you can cut benefits on very short notice. I don't think that. And so on the left, let's let it ride, that's okay. I think that's a mistake, as I will explain going along. I think it's pretty symmetric. It will reflect the political alignment. And that looks a lot like now the way it did in 1983, with the parties seeing things very differently. And to do that comparison, a couple of years ago, Sam Johnson, the head of the Social Security Subcommittee of Ways and Means, and John Larson, the ranking minority member, obviously Johnson the Republican a couple of years ago, Larson the Democrat, each filed a bill which the Office of the Actuary has a website, and you can read all the details from any proposal that they're asked to evaluate. And for the payroll tax, Johnson said no change in the payroll tax rate, no change in the maximum earnings subject to tax. What did Larson say? Large increase phased in the payroll tax rate, large increase in the earnings that it will be subject to tax. No overlap of the two sides. But there's an interesting vocabulary issue. How did Larson refer to increasing taxes? Did he actually say increasing taxes? Well, no. If you pull up his press release on the internet, his magic words were ensure Social Security remains strong well into the future. You see those words from a Democrat, it means tax increase. Now, what happened relative to benefits? Well, Johnson wanted to change the benefit formula. These numbers here tell the contribution toward that actuarial deficit that I showed you earlier. So a plus is helping to offset the problem. A minus is doing something that makes the problem worse, which you then have to do more somewhere else. So change the benefit formula, that was part of it. Increase the age for full benefits, I've already explained to you how that works. And taxation of benefits, that would be a drop in the income taxation. It was a drop in revenue that goes to Social Security, so that's a negative. Change the rules for the cost of living adjustment, that's also going to save benefits. And then do something for the very poor, which is part of the spending. What does Larson do? Larson uses those large tax increases we've already seen to increase benefits. Increase the COLA, increase benefits. So how does Johnson talk about benefit cuts? Does the word benefit cuts appear in the press release? Certainly not. Magic word, modernize how benefits are calculated. That's changed the formula. Gradually update the full retirement age. That, as I showed you, is cut benefits. Ensure benefits keep up with changes in the economy. That means a smaller cost of living adjustment. And targeting benefits for those most in need, that was cutting spouse and child benefits on the grounds, I guess, they weren't most in need. So we have quite a division, and the state of Congress is going to matter a whole lot for what the answer is. So what are our options if we get to the last minute? One option, the one they absolutely want to avoid, is a big change in benefits and/or taxes, because that will hit right away, and then comes an election, well, everybody remembers it. What else could you do to avoid that? You can phase in changes. Obviously, if you start now, you can phase in while the system still has significant money. But if you are going to do that, then you've got to get money to do that. So there are two ways to do that. One is just use general revenues. In quite a number of countries in Europe, while they have a tax dedicated for their equivalent of Social Security, they normally also use some general revenues for part of it. This is common practice, so that would be one option. Or what you could do is let Social Security borrow from the Treasury, so the money's there the same way, but the law requires Social Security to slowly pay it back with interest. And so you make the changes large enough to cover the slow phase-in. What's the difference between these two? I think the borrowing with payback is what will happen. I think the Republicans will decide they're afraid that if using general revenues for Social Security becomes standard, it will continue and there'll be lots of pressure to raise benefits some more because it's just coming out of general revenues. They're just there. And the Democrats will be afraid that the pressure on the overall deficit will come by taking the money out of Social Security. So neither of them, I think, will like that solution. With the payback, it's sort of out of their hands again. It'll be on automatic pilot, as it has been since 1983, where they just don't have to do anything. So the idea of borrowing with payback is not new. We've had serious proposals from commissions, the ones I referred to earlier that didn't work. They're there already. I don't think there'll be any resistance. So what else could we do of reform rather than keeping it just in the form it's been in? Well, there are lots of things we could do, but there are three I want to talk about. One possibility is to find a new revenue source besides taxing payroll and taxing benefits, and a candidate for that is the estate tax. A second thing we could do is change the portfolio away from just Treasury. And the third thing we could do is put in place rules that will make future changes as needed. And I'll come back to each of these three in the few minutes left. The idea of using the estate tax goes back a long way. This is Thomas Paine. This is 1797. And he is suggesting that every young person on turning 21 be given a pot of money so they've got money to start their careers with, whether they go into business or go into farming. And this was to go to both males and females, no distinction. Secondly, he wanted a retirement benefit for everybody, given life expectancy in the 18th century. He was going to start at 50. And he wanted a disability program, referred to as the lame and blind. And then he did a study of how big an estate tax would finance this specific plan, and it was a 10% tax on estates going to sons and daughters, and if you were leaving your money to somebody else, maybe you didn't have sons or daughters, then there'd be an additional tax on them, and this would be enough to finance the whole thing. So we have an estate tax that keeps jumping around. Different parties do different things to it. And one of those bills filed with the Office of the Actuary, which you can find, from Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, wants to take the estate tax, which has been made much less revenue generating, and put it back to the rules it had in 2009, and take all the revenue coming in that, and close a lot of the loopholes. You always say close the loopholes. That comes automatically. It's a macro in your word processing. And then that money would flow to Social Security, and the estimate of the Office of the Actuary is that would take care of almost 0.6 percentage points of that, just under 3. So it would solve about a third of the problem. And by itself, it would extend the depletion date, but not very far, because the money keeps coming in out in the future, so it doesn't particularly work on that. What else might you do? Well, here I want to draw on the interesting history in Canada. Canada started its system in the 60s. It looks a lot like ours. They made some of the same initial mistakes we did in the 30s. And it was a strict pay-as-you-go system, as was ours. And then they decided they didn't like that it was unfair to the young. Imagine that, unfair to the young, coming out as a political element. And so what they were going to do is two major changes in the system. One is they were going to build and maintain a substantial trust fund. The '83 law built it up and ran it down, was the plan. They want to build it up and maintain it so that it would cover about a quarter of the annual cost of benefits while keeping the system growing to keep pace with expenditures, to keep that percentage the same. It would fluctuate, but the idea was to hit that kind of target. And in order to do it, they created an investment board, totally separate from the pension system, totally separate from the government, an independent board, and instructed it to go out there and invest well, take on some risk for the return, don't overdo the risk, the usual vague words. And the board behaves just like the sovereign wealth funds that you read about. It's into things everywhere on the planet. It's into all sorts of assets. And it's so far been doing very well. And it's on track to slowly build up the fund to reach that point. They also said, if you want to expand benefits, the new benefits have to be 100% financed out of an increase in the trust fund. And they have increased benefits, and they have announced additional taxes to go with that. So it seems to me that the US could do something like that. I don't think US politics would tolerate a sovereign wealth fund type operation. But there is another option, and that's the thrift savings plan could manage it. And let me tell you a few words about the thrift savings plan. The thrift savings plan is a pension plan for federal employees. So there are over 3 million people, workers and retirees, in this plan. So it's as large as the pension plans in lots of countries. It has a limited set of investment options for the individuals. It has 5 funds plus a life cycle fund. One is federal bonds, if you really want to be cautious. The other 4 are index funds. The index funds are not run by this government agency. They're run in the private market. If you have a successful index fund, you could bid for the right of being the index fund on this pension platform. The bids, I think, come in, I think the most expensive of the funds is 3 basis points. Way less than not only the best available to individuals, but way less than the average, which the people in their pension funds shop around and end up in all sorts of places. It seems, and at the time this was done, in '83, the same time when new hires in federal employment were put in Social Security, so they had to change their previous system. There was a lot of concern at the time that Congress would meddle with the thrift savings plan. That hasn't happened. There's no sign of it. And something like TSP in a different structure is being done in the UK, goes by the acronym NEST, N-E-S-T. And again, so far there's been no meddling, but it hasn't been around very long. The other lesson from Canada is they have an automatic adjustment process. What they do is they have a chief actuary, a lot like our chief actuary. I suspect they're good friends. They only do this every 3rd year. not every year. I think our actuary would love that. And if the chief actuary says, at the current payroll tax rate, we don't meet our goals for 75 years. And the goal is not running out of money, but also maintaining a fund large enough to do what the fund is supposed to do relative to expenditures. Then there's time for the government to respond. It's a little complicated because it's a joint federal-provincial operation. And if the government doesn't respond in that window, then the payroll tax rate goes up and the cost of living adjustments go down, and they do that for the 3 years until the next report is in. So it's an automatic adjustment that will keep moving it to make sure that it's sustainable. We could do something like that. Several other countries have been moving in that direction. I think it's a great idea. And my closing slide is a picture I took at the FDR Memorial in Washington. He, of course, is the president who launched Social Security, and I thought these sentiments were an appropriate way to finish this talk. Thank you.
So why don't we start with Social Security first. And some of my questions are going to be a little devil's advocate in a sense. So one of the proposals, even as far back as Payne, is to raise the estate tax. And the question I have is probably more of an economics question. But when you raise the estate tax too much, does it have negative consequences on this idea that people who have been prudent and saved money all their life and want to pass it on to their future generations then get penalized for that? And so that's my question, sort of, how do you balance those kind of ideas?
Balance is the right word. The important thing when you hear a sentence like you just heard is to recognize you weren't given a context. You were told there's an effect here. If we collect more tax revenue, it's going to come from someone. And maybe it'll come from someone you think is a good person. How's that for a description? That, there's no question, it'll come from someone, and some of those people will be good people. But what you need for a discussion of the idea is a context. So let me now launch into a context. First of all, if you're going to have a government, and you're not Saudi Arabia sitting on all that oil, you're going to have taxes. The alternative to having taxes is not having a government. Failed states, we've seen what that means. Civil wars, total economic decline. For all the shortcomings of government, I think it beats no government, hands down. So we're going to have a government. We're going to have taxes. We're going to have some disagreements about how much we ought to be taxing and what we ought to spend on. Let me put it in today's context. I was just at a conference run by the Peterson Institute looking at what's been going on for the last 40 years in terms of how well people have been doing. And over the last 40 years, there's been a big increase in inequality, which is the way they framed the conference. But I would frame it as there's been a lot of people in this country who have done poorly relative to what similarly positioned people had done before that, what other people have been doing since then, and what expectations they've had. And the conference went into a range of things that contributed to it. Some of it things that affected lots of countries, some of it affected us, but not the European advanced countries. And to my mind, the most obvious thing that we need is we've been doing too little investment, public investment, investment by the federal government in education, in roads, bridges, dams. I guess dams in California are a particular concern. in basic research, which lies behind all of the technology which the private sector then converts into things. So the internet started from government-financed research. We have been underinvesting for 40 years, and we have been collecting too little revenue to finance not just the investment we should have been doing, but also to not let the debt get as large as it has, which, like climate change, is going to be a problem for the younger people down the road. So I start by saying we need a lot more revenue. Next, let's have a discussion of which taxes to change. And in order to have that discussion, you've got to say, it's this tax or that tax. Who does this tax fall on? Who does that tax fall on? Can they afford it? Does it have bad incentives, as you were suggesting? And to my mind, the estate tax is, other than a tax on carbon, that's the winner. But a tax on estates is the best tax we could be increasing. First of all, it only falls on the slice that really accumulate a lot. How lot remains to be seen. It falls at a time when the people are not alive and don't need the money. It falls on their heirs, and if we're talking about big estates, the heirs will be inheriting money rather than being prudent and hardworking. They may also be prudent and hardworking and creative and innovators. And from what I've seen in the literature, there are a lot of incentives to try to avoid the tax, but there's been very little sign of incentives to do things that get in the way of the economy. A bit on moving, we've just seen that with the president. But if it's a federal tax rather than a state tax, that's it. But if you compare it with a tax on labor supply, a tax on savings by current people, it seems to me it's the winner.
Okay.
The other thing, just let me touch, is there are things that there's widespread consensus that we don't do well. And I would put at the head of the list in terms of its importance, capital gains taxation isn't done well. So I would put that high up to address that too.
When you say it's not done well, you mean it should be higher or worse?
No, it should be different.
Okay.
We collect the capital gains tax on realization at a rate that depends on that year's tax rate. So that says people can realize it when they think the tax rate is low. They can put off paying the taxes even though the taxes were collected on interest, collected on dividends. So it creates an incentive to pay off the shareholders in a way that they get taxed less, which is an incentive for different ways of financing things, leading to, I suspect, far more debt by corporations than would be otherwise ideal. And we can collect taxes on realization, but tax them as if we were collecting it along the way.
Okay, thanks. Interesting perspective. Your work with Peter Orszag, your book, and correct me if I make mistakes here, the main reason Social Security is behind for everyone here, we're living longer, earnings growth has been high, and we have a legacy.
Earnings growth has been low, slight typo there.
So what is the earnings part? So let me finish. Legacy cost is the third bit.
As the third
so
bit.
What is the second bit?
As wages grow, money comes in first, and then benefits get larger and are paid later.
Okay.
So if you get a slowdown in wage growth, that means your cash flow is doing poorly. Eventually, there'll be a return. We've got a short-term problem till 2035. So it's the low wage growth that's giving us that problem.
Okay, and so your solutions were, in your book, higher payroll taxes, lower benefits, you had a combination, increase the maximal taxable earnings. I think today it's at $137,000, but you would put it higher. and include more workers who are not paying this tax. I think that's your solution. And so any comment you have about that, and as it compares, for example, to Larson and Johnson, and is anyone getting close to what you propose?
Okay. The one thing that is in the book, which I haven't mentioned in the reforms, is a practice that has started being common in other countries, which is to include an automatic adjustment in the rules for life expectancy. So in Sweden, for example, when they calculate your benefit when you retire, they look to see what life expectancy is for your cohort. And much like going to an insurance company and buying an annuity, they adjust it for that. They adjust it a bit in advance to give you warning. This kind of adjustment is common. In Sweden, it all comes out of benefits, comes out of new benefits. It also would show up as people are anticipating benefits, the current workers. In contrast, as I showed you in Canada, they don't do an adjustment for life expectancy, but when life expectancy grows, the actuary is going to say the cost is up, and they will do something you saw in the automatic in response to raise taxes. What Peter and I said is, what would you do as an individual, if you, a young individual, 20s, if you woke up and realized your life expectancy was much longer than you thought it was when you made whatever plan you made for retirement savings and all of that? Well, you've got three margins. You could save more, consume less now. You can have less after you're retired. You can work longer. Our hypothesis is the sensible answer is some of all of these. So our proposal was, first of all, to do a calculation. Life expectancy projections have gone up. There's an impact of that on the actuarial balance of the system. Let's cut that in half, solve half the problem with higher taxes, solve half the problem with lower benefits, and don't mess with the age for full benefits, because that's just a way to cut benefits, which actually is a little bit uneven. Let's just do it smoothly for different retirement ages. So it's two things: get automatic indexing in there, not just say, as we did in '83, oh, in 2009 we'll change that by 2 months, because life expectancy changes sometimes in surprising ways. So do it automatically and do it in a balanced way across the different areas.
Okay, great, thank you. Now we'll turn to some lighter questions. Well, not yet, but they're not Social Security questions. What do you think is the most important economic problem in the world today, or in just the United States, and the most important area that economists should be focused on?
Aren't those the same thing? I'm going to give you two answers. One is climate change. Climate change, we have been ignoring climate change for 40 years. The first scientific articles coming out are saying it's likely this is coming. We don't have a good picture of how it will play out. That picture has been steadily refined. The idea that you don't do anything because you don't know exactly how bad it's going to be strikes me as nuts. What you want is insurance against what's going to come, preparation for it, and a lot of research on figuring out what to do and how to get started on it. Instead, for 40 years, we did a little bit, and that little bit is being undone. This, as we're seeing from the changes that are already coming, and if you'll excuse the expression, fires, larger hurricanes, droughts, this is coming. We don't know the details, but the thought of not cranking up on it right away, to my mind, is really folly. And a carbon tax is a good way to start, and the revenues can be used in part to cushion people relative to the impact. But it's not a standalone solution to our problems. We need a whole lot of government investment in R&D, government regulation, as we have gotten from automobiles. And as you know, there's an ongoing fight about what will happen between California and Washington. So that's number one. But a lot of that is science rather than economics, so it's not really my answer. What's really my answer is we've had 40 years of really poor economic developments for the majority of our population, and we need to address that, and we need to address it just the way I said. I haven't changed my mind since 30 seconds ago. A lot more revenue and a lot more investment.
Thank you. What is the biggest lesson that you've learned in your career about economics?
I'm going to respond in terms of the chronological. When you start learning economics, as I did in my second year in college, you get, the simple models giving you insights in what's going on. And then as you get into advanced classes, the models get a little more sophisticated and cover more issues. In graduate school, there's even more of it. What it took me a while to realize is there's another step. The models are there to give you insight into how things work in the economy. And the critical step is how do you use what you learn from the theoretical modeling and the empirical modeling in order to guide policy, which has become, as you said, I started graduate school in mathematics. I got interested in economics because I liked doing mathematics that way. And it was only a decade later, when I got drawn into Social Security, that for the first time I actually started thinking about policy, started thinking about how you can frame how to do policy well, how to have good policies. And it's that shift from how do I build a model? You have to learn that if you want to be an economist. To how do I use a model? And you have to learn that if you want to do a good job in trying to influence policy.
Thank you. So now we're going to ask a couple questions about what he won the Nobel Prize for. So you won the Nobel Prize, they said, for analyzing markets with search frictions. And one of your early papers did, in fact, look at this, and I mentioned it in the introduction. Has the internet and posted prices changed any of your original research? So now you can, presumably you can see prices with very low cost, maybe.
Okay. Two things. The insight in the paper, which was referred to as a paradox, was even a very tiny cost of doing this could lead to a very large change in prices. And why is that? Because firms compete with each other. So we're sitting there thinking, not understanding this. Obviously, the business people understood this long before the economists did. If I think you may not know what the price is elsewhere, I think, well, I could push it up a little bit and I probably won't lose too much business. And the other stores engaged in this will have the same thought. They will say, I could push it up a little bit. And then you look at each other, and you've each pushed it up a little bit. So now you can push it up a little bit again. And now, and again, and again. And indeed, the way, just for those of you interested in research, the way I got to this was not by thinking about that, but rather I was looking to answer a different question, which is, at the time, there was a lot of focus on how you would find the prices for equilibrium. And there were studies of what's called tâtonnement, differential equations, adjusting prices depending on the difference between demand and supply, and looking to see if it went to competitive equilibrium. I said, that's the wrong question. And for those of you who end up being researchers, the most important thing you do is picking the right question rather than the wrong question. That's the wrong question. The right question is, what's a plausible dynamic and where does it go? And so I made up this very simple story that you check prices one at a time. And I said, now what would the firms do? And math was routine. And lo and behold, this seemingly perfectly competitive equilibrium, everybody colluded on the monopoly price, because that was the only place where you didn't want to push it up anymore, which you could because people weren't checking. Now, I know when you go on the internet, you get a pop-up offering $5 off if you buy it right now. So, and even if it's only a little bit of a pain to check 3 or 4 prices, some people will do it and lots of people won't. And that's part of, in later research, what gives you a distribution of prices. There'll be some firms that are particularly looking for the people who are checking, and some firms who are particularly hoping for the people who aren't checking. And you get distribution of prices. And the fact that you have a distribution of prices says that that whole process of not knowing all the prices matters.
Okay, great. So as fascinating as that was, what is the most important or practical thing that's come out of search theory?
It plays a central role in interpreting what's going on in the labor market, in part in interpreting it for the Fed in making monetary policy, in part interpreting it for what has been driving the share of income going to labor down compared to the historic fraction. And I think the process in the labor market of these frictions, of search is the wrong word for it. I think we made a blunder choosing that, because an awful lot of what happens, particularly in the labor market, is really evaluation. So firm posts a vacancy, and then a bunch of people apply, and the firm picks a subset to actually check out, and you're all sitting around waiting while this process goes on. And it may be instantaneous now with the internet. Whenever there's a new job, you know it exists, but it doesn't mean you can get it instantaneously. So it's a whole process, realistic process in the labor market, calls for interpreting the finding out and the evaluating as something playing out in real time and playing out in a way that responds to, for example, the images of what else is going on, your beliefs about the future. I think, for example, the reason there's been so little of people leaving jobs for other jobs compared to historically relative to the unemployment rate is nervousness. Just as my parents' generation, who lived through the Great Depression, were much more cautious about the stock market than my generation. And people who have been through the Great Recession are going to be cautious about things like changing employers.
Interesting. Okay, great. We're hang in there, guys, because we have some really good questions now. I mean, those are great questions, but these are the ones I think that we get excited about. So how did your life change after winning the Nobel Prize, and what is the coolest thing that happened to you?
Well, the most noticeable change is I got invited to places like here and lots of other places. It was much more in the early years. I'm still getting probably 3 speaking invitations a week
Wow.
So part of this is rethinking what you do with your time, rethinking what are your criteria for doing this talk rather than that talk, and all sorts of things. I have family in Berkeley, so coming here had a bonus to it. I was happy to come here, happy to be in a good academic setting, happy to be paid. And I'm an economist, right? But all of these things have different mixes with different audiences. The coolest thing I want to tell you is something my wife did. Well, let me go back a step. This is not an answer to your question, but I think you'll all like the story. People seem to be very interested about the phone call. The phone call comes 1 hour before the press conference in Stockholm. So on the East Coast, it's 6 a.m. When it happens here, it's 3 a.m. So where was I at 6 a.m. on the day when that phone call came? The answer is I was in a plane. I had been in New Zealand giving talks, even though I didn't have a Nobel Prize. I had flown a red-eye from New Zealand to San Francisco. I had missed connections, spent the day wearily in the airport, got on another red-eye to home, and at 6 a.m. I was on a red-eye. The phone rings at home. My wife tells the story much better than I do, but I will try to imitate her. She picks up the phone and she thinks it's me and says, "Hi, Petey." The plane landed early, and then this very sophisticated female voice with a touch of a foreign accent says, "Is Professor Diamond there?" My wife is a bit puzzled, thinking this is somebody confused about the time difference. And she says, "No." And the woman says, "Does he have a cell phone?" And my wife says, "Yes." And the woman says, "Will you give me his number?" And my wife, at this point, we have sometimes done joint presentations around this whole process. My wife says to the audience, "I'm thinking I'm not telling his phone number to you, sister." And then the woman says, "I'm calling from Stockholm." And my wife, and I'm sorry, and then my wife says, "Here's his cell phone number." Except we have similar numbers. And my wife gave her her cell phone number rather than mine. And the woman says, "I'm sorry, I woke you." And my wife says, "If you woke me for the reason I think you woke me, you don't have to apologize." So then she picks me up at the airport, and now I'll get to the cool thing. My wife's, well, she's a graduate of Bolt Hall, was a lawyer for a while, and then had a career at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The peak of her career was helping to organize the show Monet in the 90s, about the paintings Monet did in that period. The show was at Boston, and then at Chicago, and then at London. It drew 1.5 million people, far more than all of my talks put together. And she knew there was a major Monet show happening in Paris, and it had been totally sold out. It was huge, it was going to be packed, it was going to be awful. And she had the bright idea that after Stockholm, why don't we stop in Paris? And I said, okay. And she called the French embassy in Boston and says, "My husband has just won the Nobel Prize. On our way back from Stockholm, we would like to stop and see the Monet show. And we'd like to see it when it's not crowded." And my wife spent her junior year in Paris, so her image of the French comes from that. And she was expecting he would slam down the phone and she'd hear Merd in the background. And what he said was, "What day, what time?" So that was the coolest
That was the
thing.
coolest. Who was a mentor of yours, and can you describe the greatest lessons he or she taught you? And what are the greatest lessons you've passed on to students?
Okay, well, my mentor was and is Bob Solow. He turned 95 this summer. He's still as sharp as ever doing work. The talk I gave at the Peterson Institute that I made reference to, I was having a lot of trouble organizing what it was I wanted to say out of the list of various things. So I had lunch with him. He told me what to do, and I did it, and it worked. He helped me with my thesis. I had trouble finding a topic for one of the essays. He said, "Why don't you read this?" He didn't tell me what to look for, what to do. He just suggested I read some. I read it, and I saw instantly how I could create a paper related to it. I was told by a former student I saw at the memorial service recently that that's what I did with him. That he was working on a thesis, spinning his wheels, and I suggested he go read something, and I named what he should read. So that's one of the lessons. The other lesson is I taught at MIT for a long time. I taught at Cal first, and in '66 I went to MIT. MIT has been a wonderful place. And it's been a wonderful place in part from a design that Bob Solow had. And it had two elements in it. One element is your research is important, but it's making this a good place for students is number one. So you're in the office, your door is open, you're available, you take teaching seriously, and everybody, including not just Solow, but Samuelson, teaches the required classes, teaches the undergraduates as well as the graduates. And we turn this into a place where everybody enjoys being here, students and faculty. And if we do that, we will attract good students, and teaching good students is more fun than teaching not so good students. And secondly, he said, the important thing in sustaining the department is making good appointments. And places go astray when the senior people, as they go along, are making the critical appointments because they may be out of date with what's really important. They may be particularly concerned about people interested in what they've been interested in. So the rule was the senior appointment process would be dominated by the younger tenured faculty. And at one point, Bob himself announced in a meeting, "I'm happy to be in this meeting, but I'm not going to vote on," we had two candidates for a slot, "I'm not going to vote on who to do it. It's your job. It's not mine."
Wow, that's fascinating. A similar question, what is something that you've learned from a family member that has helped you in your career? So a family member.
Well, you gave me this question ahead of time, and I've racked my brain. And so what I will tell you is why I don't have an answer to that.
Okay.
First of all, let me tell you the context in which I'm answering. When I give the short version of my work life, it goes, I went to college, I loved it, I never left. Now, my grandparents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. My mother was one of 8. She was born in New York, but the 6 older ones weren't. My mother was very proud. She finished high school. None of her siblings, very few of her peers did. College, she didn't know anything about. My father, also born in New York, his parents met in New York, and he was born in New York. He was of a generation where you could go directly from high school to law school, and he did that. He sold shoes during the day. He did his homework on the subway from the Bronx to Brooklyn, and he went to Brooklyn Law School at night. College, doesn't know anything about. So when I was going off on that trajectory I've described, nobody was trying to give me advice because it was terra incognita to them and they knew it. There was all the advice about being a good person, but that doesn't quite answer where I think your question was.
So this is not a scheduled question, but you're clearly...
That's not fair.
Yeah. But you're clearly very smart, and you were very smart in mathematics in particular. So you may not have the answer to this, but I'll ask it. What do you think made you so good in mathematics and then economics? Was it genetics? Do you think it's you worked hard, or none of the above? What do you think?
How about all of the above?
Okay.
Let me be clear. I'm a better economist than I would have been a mathematician. I was good at mathematics. I mean, good enough to be admitted to the MIT PhD program and other places as well. And the mathematics, I think in mathematics. So when I approach an economics question, I'm doing it through not explicit equations, but an image, a chunk in the vocabulary of mindset around the framing of how the equations might come together. But in economics, I have a knack, which I don't think I had in math, or there was certainly no sign of it while I was there, of spotting a good question. Now, where does that come from? I don't have a clue. I'm sure there's a genetic component. How could there not be? I'm sure the fact that I went to public schools that expected me to take my work seriously and do it helped. I'm sure it mattered when I got to college that I was in a place where there was serious teaching, trying to develop the thought process rather than just the simple learning. And you left out, I was lucky.
Thank you. So we're almost done, guys. We have the audience questions that I want to get to. Out of all your accomplishments, what are you most proud of and why?
I've done work on search modeling in 3 different contexts: retail markets, labor market, and a way of thinking about macroeconomics in the whole economy. I've done other papers that have been very well received. They all had the property that I came in on an idea and it happened quickly. Sometimes it came out of, I was teaching and I didn't like the literature and I decided to work up something new, and then I realized what I was working on was much more interesting than just the simple question I was at. Or I saw something and I saw a better way of doing it. And in those cases, the paper comes quickly. When I started at Search, it was just like that. It was a couple of months till I had the heart of it all set, max. Then when I wanted to move from that first into the labor market, and then from that into the macro, that was very hard. It took me a decade. I actually spent some time in the mid-70s trying to reshape my brain, because I would start thinking about a problem out of standard general equilibrium demand and supply, and then modify it to bring in something else. And I realized that that methodology would not work for the search questions, the labor market, and the whole economy. And so I looked for a question, not that a question that would be interesting. I looked for a question which I knew could not be answered if I started in that place. And I would start thinking about that question. And before I knew it, I had slipped back into forcing the question into the model I knew didn't work. And I kept at it for a couple of years of working at stuff that was only interesting if it could change my brain. And at some point, it did. And so it's that sequence that gives me the pride for that part of the search stuff. And the macro part was even more, because after I had the labor part, the next step, again, I couldn't get there. And I didn't have to undo a brain. I just had to figure out what was different. And I spent at least a year, maybe more, trying to think about that. Now, I did other things while doing these things, but it was, I mean, in a way, it's the labor theory of value I'm expressing the most pride over, the thing that was hardest to do.
Okay, we have just 2 questions left, so thank you for being patient. First question, these are audience questions. If you could scrap the current model of Social Security and start from 0, what would you do?
I wouldn't take that as my mindset to begin. In my books with Nick Barr, we have books, Ludwig has talked about the stuff I've written about the US, but I've written a couple of books about pension systems generally, and we've studied lots of different countries, some in detail, some casually. And one of our first themes is there is no single best pension system. A pension system has to fit with, you want a pension system to be sustainable economically and politically. You want it to fit with the needs of your country. And that's going to be different in different places. And one of the things sometimes you've got a system that has some fundamental flaws and you've got to wipe it out and start over. And Sweden did that in the mid-90s. Sweden is a country where I think there were 7 separate parties in the parliament at the time. 5 of them came together, formed a committee, the furthest left and furthest right not playing, and redesigned the pension system that then had the political support because it was coming in that way. I think in the US, it wouldn't work to do that. What we would get over scrapping and starting over would be a political civil war, as we have whenever we go to touch Social Security. But around Social Security, we have a political history and a public awareness that affects the politics. So I would start by saying, we're going to keep the basic structure. And I would have quite a list of things I would want to change. Some of them I've already talked about. But just to give you a sense of the issue, one of the controversial elements in the system, and it has been for decades, is the particular way they do benefits for non-working spouses. And every time they go to change that, the half of the country that thinks it's really important for mothers to stay home with children object. And the people who think it's really important for women to have not just the opportunity to work, but actually to be out there and earning and doing well, they want to change it. And there has never been the remotest chance of tinkering with what we inherited from the beginning, because the politics, it's one of the things that we don't seem to have a sign of bridging. They bridged that issue in Sweden by dividing up and not having one system as we do, but having two, and getting the left put out the rules for one of them and the right put out the rules for the other. And the rules are kind of like this in terms of the treatment of couples. So each one got a piece the way they wanted, and they were willing to live with that compromise. I'm not sure what would happen here.
Okay, thank you. So the last question is, what 3 pieces of advice would you give to University of San Francisco students to be successful in their business career or their life career?
Ooh, that's not fair. You only said business career in the written version, and I had a good answer for that. I've never been in business. I'm not going to try to give anybody advice. For life advice, I'll throw in a little something. One of my sons, after he got his BA, went to a community college to get a credential for occupational therapy. And not totally surprisingly, he was graduating right after I got the Nobel Prize, and guess who they wanted for the commencement speaker? So I thought about commencement speech for community college. Community college has 50-year-olds trying to do something new, has students there for 2 years to cut the cost of getting the next 2 for a bachelor, has people like my son, who at the time, I guess, was probably in his mid-30s. And I looked online to begin with, what else do we all do? And there were all sorts of fabulous commencement speeches. They were all at top universities telling people to go out and conquer the world. And that just didn't seem right. So what I thought about, and I thought about when I went to graduate school, I didn't yet know whether I was going to study math or economics. I was doing both in my first year until I settled on it. And drawing on that, I put forward the idea to think about your experiences as an experiment to be evaluated. And it's not that I do this and I stick with it because I'm a stick with it guy, or it's not that I bounce around, try anything. It's that you got to evaluate. Experiments are useful when we can evaluate them and draw inferences, and to keep an open mind. And that's what I would say, even to people going into business, if not especially to people going into business.
I think that's phenomenal advice. Thanks very much. Thank you very much.